We were talking about the Gemini Alliance, where you have a hub and spoke model. What are your thoughts on this?
This is a model that has been used for decades in the airline business. And if it works for an industry that is not too different, you need to make a case why it should not work rather than why it should work in your industry. For container shipping carriers, the impact of AI will be material, but for digital logistics, it could be finally the breakout.
Welcome to another episode of the Schelling Point, where ideas meet. Today, I have a very special guest, Kai Marcus-Peschel. I know Kai from Hapag-Lloyd. He used to be in M&A and strategy office at Hapag-Lloyd. And before that, he was a consultant. On the side, he writes a Substack on AI. And that's also another reason I connected with him more deeply than just a random meeting in Hapag-Lloyd head office. How are you doing, Kai?
I'm good, Bertrand. How are you?
Good. I'm really excited to have this call with you because I think among the people in the shipping industry, you are probably the only one that I know that spend as much energy on AI. And I can tell because you have the proof of work, because you're writing a Substack, which is much, much harder than writing a LinkedIn post. We get to that at one point. Let's start from the beginning. How actually did you end up at Hapag-Lloyd? What's your career path?
I don't have the typical shipping career where you start very early on in shipping. Similar like you, ending in the industry in a number of happy accidents. I don't even have a business or engineering background. I studied history and international relations, so war and peace, geopolitics, which explains perhaps my interest in strategy, because these are often strategic questions around security, as we have seen in the last years with the number of conflicts we still have going on. On the other hand, I think it also explains my interest in people and institutions, because in history, you have big thinkers or decision makers, generals or presidents, and they play very important roles. And I, to some degree, apply this to the world of business, where I care deeply to understand, not just the Elon Musks and the Steve Jobs, but also understand how individual managers define the path of a company, define the course of their responsibility. So I care deeply about trying to get into people's heads to make better decisions and work better. And on the other hand, institutions is really interesting because social science look a lot like history or international relations. They look at things that are not very easy to quantify. So you can describe an institution and it's not super scientific compared to mathematics or other sciences where you can sort of say prove something with a number. But I still think it's important to look at how does something really work? Like how does a company work? It's not just how do the individual departments work with each other? How do you create constructive tension, as I like to call it, between departments to make sure that they take better decisions? Everybody optimizing for themselves. In history and in international relations, you do have to care a lot about institutions. Like how does the Ministry of War or a central bank or a big institution work? And I kind of brought that interest into the world of business. And I also ask lots of stupid questions. If I don't understand something, I always ask. And it's okay not to know everything. And I probably learned that in university, where in social science, you don't have fixed frameworks. This is not like Porter's 5 forces or a mathematical theorem where you apply something that already exists to a situation. And I think that's also a really fun part of the job, is to try to find out what's going on. How does this process work? How do these two departments work together? How can we fix this problem? That's been very much on my mind. And so that's the background. And if you ask, how did I end up in shipping specifically? I joined a very large European airline straight out of university and stayed there for 5 years and really enjoyed working in that airline setting. And that kind of also put me on a path towards the transportation industry. I think there's something really attractive about transporting goods or people. It's a product that you can see. It's a product that physically exists. It's not just some virtual thing in a virtual world, but it is real things getting from people to other people. I think it's a very pleasant industry. And it's always big pieces of metal, steel, whether it's a vessel, plane, or a truck. I think there's something very, very, how do I put it? There's something very heartfelt around transportation compared to perhaps other industries that are more in the heads and less on the roads. And that airline time was really interesting And then I said, working for that large European airline is also a little bit boring. And then I was approached by a strategy consultant, a tier 2 strategy consultant.
I won't say tier 2, it's pretty good.
It's not the McKinsey's. And that's, I think, to make the point, they work for medium-sized customers. So they kind of got me hooked by telling me the customers that they're working on right now. And this was kind of medium-sized airlines or medium-sized transportation companies that had much more interesting problems than the airline I was working for, which was they thought they were God's gift to the world. And they were the best airline on the planet, and they had an answer to everything. And it's much more interesting and I think that also applies to all business settings, to work for companies that are probably medium sized. You're much closer to the product, you're much closer to the customers. There's much less silos and much less kind of experts sitting in ivory towers. And I really liked working in strategy consulting, but for these kind of medium-sized engagements, working for airlines, airports, and then also ending up in container shipping, because there is some parallels between the world of airlines and the world of container shipping. There could be even more of a flow of ideas and concepts and technology from one camp to the other, and mostly airlines to container shipping, because airlines are by definition always a little bit ahead and always technologically, because they had much more data that airlines have to store for legal reasons. So they were always the first to have a global distribution system, first to have e-ticketing, first to have self-service apps. You can now rebook your own flight if you're delayed, if you're stranded. When you think back 10, 15 years ago, that's pretty unique. So the airline industry is a little bit further, not because they're smarter or cooler, but because they had the data, they had the technology in place. An airline is already a rather digital place to work in. And that brought me, so to say, in a project working for an Asian container shipping carrier, applying airline knowledge. And that brought me to join Hapag-Lloyd back in 2018, where I stayed for the last 7 years.
You just said like 3 different paths that I want to go down. I think the first thing you said about your interest in history, and you believe history is something that's very important for the world of business. I couldn't agree more with you. When I first started, I was trained in math. So for me, incentive, the self-interest, rationality is very important. And I think for the traders, we already start to think about, wait, it's not always, people are not rational. So the adversity to loss will make you do different things when market goes down compared to market goes up. And then when I try to run this project with GSB and interacting with everyone, actually it's all about people. And sometimes the most important decision are made in a room by 3 guys. They don't have a full picture. They try to do what's best for them. And sometimes the decision is emotional. And so there's a lot of nuances to it. I think when you're training STEMs, you have a lot of, I would say, disdain for the social sciences. It's not replicable.
Nice, Bertrand, that you feel disdain for what I studied, but it's okay.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I used to, but now I have much, much more appreciation for it, especially, as you said, in the current world we're living, where I think people would turn towards the historian and ask how did things happen in 1945, in 1960s. Like that applies to global trade, that applies to monetary policy, that applies to everything, right? Now, historian, I think, is probably one of the most important role. And if you look at the bestseller books, it's typically biography and then history books, the nonfiction side, right? Because you always go back in history to try to extract the insight. So what you said that really resonated with me. And the other thing you said is a lot of people assume things are the way it is because it's the way it is. Actually, there's a bunch of people not smarter than us, with not more information than us, in a room making those decisions that start to impact everything. And if you start to understand history, you should realize that it's not inevitable. We can also change. I guess my point is apology to my friend who have studied history. Now I see the value. It's not just about math. The second thing you say about airlines, that also resonated with me because I was for a couple of years in the airline industry, but on the loyalty side. And indeed, there's a lot of data that you have of consumer behavior, how they fly, how they redeem their miles, and it was fascinating. But I agree with you also, it's very, very hard to make them change things. And one of in one of the projects we were dealing with yield management, basically the way to manage the price, there's a team of people manually adjusting it. And I couldn't believe it. I was like, what the hell? You can use the program to do that. Why is it still manually adjusting? So as you said, right, if you're big, you feel like you know the best. And as you say, maybe it's better to work with a second tier, a smaller airline who potentially are more desperate to do things. One thing I want to double click on, what is the thing that you felt you brought from the airline to Hapag-Lloyd?
Yeah, I think airlines have a number of black boxes where they use data or they enrich it. For example, airlines do very exact forecasts on a flight level, and they do this based on historical data, but they enrich it with other sources of information like holiday seasons, fairs, important concerts. This is very smart stuff, and that can also adjust on a very short basis. For example, if there's a strike, for example, I don't know, if there's a strike in a particular country, that will be immediately reflected in the forecasts for that particular country, but also for other countries. Perhaps that impacts their flights to a particular degree. Because if you talk about revenue management and optimizing, so to say, your top line, this is one really important aspect, is that you can accurately forecast how full your asset will be. Because in these capital-intensive industries like aviation or container shipping, is around filling the asset. You paid a lot of money to buy the asset. Now you need to utilize it every day. So having a very accurate forecast is a very useful thing, and I think this is where airlines do a really good job. And that linked to that, I think airlines often do decisions more on a numbers basis. Not that there's an analyst sitting in a dark room and preparing a report, but there's a system triggering and there's a human sitting on the other side and deciding, does that make sense? For example, if the forecast says that there's more demand on this Tuesday afternoon, we should switch the size of the plane and use a larger plane. And then there's a human sitting and checking this. But this is something that comes up automatically. Also, passenger airlines are a classical B2C industry, selling, even if you're a duty traveler, in the end, you are one guy sitting on a plane. Part of the package deal that your travel manager negotiated, you're one guy who doesn't want to get lost in transit in the airport. Even if you are traveling on business, you are a consumer. And that explains how this industry gets a lot of political attention, because the politicians think they have to protect their voters, and that makes the airline business much more difficult to navigate. Because if container shipping had the same quality requirements, for example, in Europe, the compensations you have to pay as an airline if passengers get stranded, if container shipping carriers had to pay these compensations, I think that would be the end of the business model. But to some degree, airlines are more around understanding their customers better. So even 20 years ago, there were relatively detailed customer persona, like what are the different passenger segments? Because you can easily break it down. You can understand based on their willingness to pay. There's different classes in the plane. There's different times when passengers book. And this is some very easy price adjustments that you can make, where container shipping is increasingly getting towards differentiating prices across channels, targeting different customer segments based on how and where and when they book. But airlines started doing this much earlier because they were built around a very specific understanding of having different passenger classes. Because simply there was 2 or 3 classes in a plane. There's a first class, a business class, and economy class. And passengers choose. It's not that they accidentally end up in first class, but they choose which class they fly based on their willingness to spend or ability to spend. And I think that's an increasing awareness and increasing value that container shipping carriers get out of better understanding their customers. The irony of it all is that airlines still, despite their technical advances and having super smart systems, they, on average, still earn significantly less money than many other parts of the transportation chain, because there's too many airlines. It's very easy to create an airline. There's lots of off-the-shelf IT systems. So you can lease a plane. You have around 100 people that you can steal from other airlines, lease a few planes, and then you have an airline. So yes, it's okay to open a business with 100 staff. It should be easy. But we're talking here about a company that is highly regulated with very, very expensive assets that you need to utilize every day. I think that's one big benefit that the container shipping industry has. Historically, the distribution of airline tickets was via just a few centralized system providers. And that's why even still today, you can see the prices of your competitors. There's absolute price transparency. This has slightly changed in the last years. And perhaps for everybody's benefit, this is one big system where every airline uploads their seat availabilities, their prices, their schedule. When you booked with an airline 20 years ago, your travel agent would go into these systems to book this for you. So they would not go necessarily into the system of American Airlines or Cathay or the airline you're flying with. They would go into a central system and then pull up a number of flights across different carriers. And this price transparency across different carriers, if you want to earn money, is not a very good thing for a company. And because this was historically never required, and this was historically not grown in container shipping, many of these prices were very proprietary, and you could differentiate pricing very much based on who's talking to you. That allows you to make sure that people who are willing to spend more can spend more. That is a big benefit for the container shipping industry, that there's limited price transparency on what is going on in the market. That's one of the factors. There's other factors. For example, there's tenders. There's big customers in container shipping that secure a lot of space. Like for airlines, even companies that travel a lot will have a very small share on the total revenue share of an airline. And I'm making these numbers up, but they're probably not too wrong. A really, really big customer may have less than 1% of the revenue, much less than 1% of the revenue of a global airline. While this is, of course, we know that not just the forwarders, they could be
Walmart.
Walmarts of this world. That could be a very important part of the business of a container shipping carrier, which again allows you to look at individual customers more on a case-by-case basis. There could be one person or a number of people probably looking after Walmart, and they have an understanding of what's going on. And they can take much better decisions than some system in an airline where they try to give you a better rate, or they try to attract your business by negotiating a better deal. So that's the irony. Airlines may be technically more advanced, having more data and maybe much faster in decision making, but have a much harder time to earn money on a consistent basis.
That's super interesting what you say. Because I think Sabre is the first one. The first GDS that started Sabre, which used to be a system developed by American Airlines. And the US, it convinced all the airlines to pump the data. And then it was a big scandal at that point because Sabre was favoring American Airlines over the other airlines. If I recall correctly, when the travel agent research in Sabre, the first plane that comes, it's always American Airlines. Then the other guys started to wise up, hold on, what's going on here? Then those GDS became more neutral. I had actually the same thought when I first started to look at the shipping industry. Why not business class? Why can't we charge some customer more money so that the container can leave faster the yard, like the airlines? And the second thing, as you said, maybe the reason container line is not as commoditized is because you have those large customers and you can start to design more specific program for them. But then another episode we had with Adrian at OCL, right, when I asked him, do you have a bespoke product for them specifically? And my feeling based on his answer is actually not really. You have to somewhat offer commoditized service. What special service does Walmart get compared to an average customer?
I think that's a big question. And perhaps let me answer not the exact same question, but a similar question. I think the container shipping carriers have bespoke products. The most prominent example is reefers. In terms of revenues, but also what they do for that. There's a physical product differentiation. You make sure that there's more plugs on board the ships. You make sure that these containers get moved with more attention. There's some carriers who started putting trackers in reefers. I would argue a lot of the big reefer customers do get a very high degree of hypercare across the different container shipping carriers. If you're just looking at the big, the banana reefers.
What do you mean by hypercare?
Making sure that these containers move in faster, that they don't get lost on the yard, that they there's more attention. For example, if these containers transship, there's more attention on the transshipment working. There is also much more availability of people to call to ask what's going on. Transparency about what is going on and having a person to speak to, I think, is probably the one of the key, not just a stupid chatbot that is looking up data in a database, but like a more customized product. What is actually going on, and why will the containers make the transshipment? And please don't just give me the answer that some algorithm has calculated. Can you give me a guarantee that the ship will wait, or can you give me a guarantee that you will make sure that the containers get there on time? The question is there willingness to pay, and is there an urgent enough need for that? And I think for reefers, there's a clearly physical dimension. The whole product doesn't work if you don't offer that kind of service. And there it works. And the fact that there is less of a hypercare approach looking after a sub-product or creating sub-products, this means that it's either technically very difficult to do or not profitable for a carrier to pull off.
Yeah.
So, which is linked to perhaps the willingness of the customers is too low to pay more for these services.
Yeah.
But this is not this is not the final statement by this. It does not work, but we can only look at what's going on, and we see that some things not there, and then we can hypothesize why is it not there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we talk more about the shipping in a moment, but let's double click back to the Substack. So I mentioned that you started 12 months ago a Substack online, and you've written more than 50 posts. So congratulations. First question I have for you is, why did you start the Substack, and what actually kept you going for 50 episodes of it?
50 episodes. That sounds a bit like a Colombian soap opera.
Yes.
Perhaps to explain what a Substack is. A Substack is more or less a newsletter where you get a newsletter off the shelf. I don't have to care about the hosting, the domain. I don't have to manage email recipient lists or data protection issues. So to say, there's a provider. I just start posting things, and people can magically subscribe to that, and I can so to say, share these posts and then get people, so to say, hooked. They subscribe, they read more, and that's it. So that's the Substack. To answer your question, I started writing about AI because my assumption was that this will be so life-changing that I would like to not just be a bystander, but at least have a little bit of, not skin in the game, but be a little bit more involved, build my own opinion on what's going on. One benefit of having to write about AI is that you need to try it. So I signed up for all the different large language models, all the new Chinese open source models, just to try them, to see what's going on. I've used the research models, and this alone, just because you want to kind of have an opinion about it, that requires you to look at it and use it.
Yep.
And I think that already has intrinsic value. So in case you want to learn something or acquire a skill or you know more about something, writing is actually really helpful, because I felt a bit like I was a high school journalist writing about a silly topic. It's not just in like a cringe-worthy LinkedIn post where you recommend yourself for appearing in a podcast, but it is, you actually have an opinion. You state an opinion, and then you explain why you arrived at that opinion. And that helps you form a view on what is going on. So that is one factor. And the other factor is that I'm a big believer of writing is much more valuable than just thinking. It's very easy to have a thought. The thoughts come to us all day, and we don't have to do anything, and we just have thoughts. And sometimes we have thoughts, and they seem absolutely brilliant. Yeah, this really makes a lot of sense. And I think we all have been part of meetings where people have shared their thoughts immediately without filtering and without thinking too much about whether that thought actually made sense. But like having a thought is just one step, and then once you start to write it down, and you suddenly realize that it is not super nuanced, and perhaps it's not that novel, or there's much more you can add to that thought. That probably was a good thought, and it puts you on the right track, but you need to add more to that. There was an article by Paul Graham in October 2024 that put that, and that's been around, been discussed, I think, for much longer, saying a thought matures once you start to write about it, and then you can do much more with it in a business context. Rather than just blurt out whatever your opinion is in a meeting, just think about it, make it more nuanced, see perhaps the pros and cons, work with your thoughts, and then put them back. Just this is probably much more useful for yourself and your company and your business than just having a thought. And that is, so to say, the second thought that I had. Not only do I have to learn about AI by writing about it, but also my thinking will become more nuanced about AI. And I think that is, in hindsight, very helpful, because it is very easy to see that AI is huge and will have a tremendous impact. But the fact that we still don't know how exactly it will affect any company, and there's lots of thoughts, and there's lots of ideas, and there's lots of hypotheses, but the fact that there's people running around saying, well, in a few years, millions of people could be unemployed, or all the entry-level jobs will disappear. If we honestly accept these kinds of discussions and still go to the office every day, just shows that there's a huge there's a lack of clarity and a lack of understanding of what's actually happening. And it's not that anybody will have an answer to this tomorrow. I think it will gradually mature up to the point when it then becomes clear what the actual impact is. But I think it's very important to have start building yourself an opinion how AI can impact us personally. Education is also very, very important. Kids now growing up using ChatGPT or in university, what's the value of education if you just use ChatGPT to write an essay and that is satisfy the system by throwing an essay into the machine and then you get a grade at the end? That's not learning. So there's lots of question marks around AI and it's not just about business.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. The thing is the highest leverage tool that you can master. I don't think it's just about shaping your idea better. It's also a very good filter. It happens a lot to me, right? I was like, oh, this is a great idea. Let me try to write it down. Once you write it down, you realize there's a big logical fallacy. And also, if you write it down, you can step away for a day or two, read again. So if you can go a couple times by writing, then you pass the test. And then you say, okay, actually, this is a really good idea. I think there's a lot of law about Amazon, but the thing about replacing PPT with memo, I think it's actually a pretty good idea where you force people to write what is exactly the idea. So, okay, I understand motivation.
So Bertrand, can I jump in 2 points? Just to be clear, well, we're not stepping on anybody's toes by saying that thoughts are not well thought out. I think that the thoughts are bad. The key point is it's really helpful to help a thought mature into something much better by writing more about it. And there's ways like just starting to write it down or trying to explain it to a colleague or writing it down in an email. Or as you mentioned, the Amazon memo, which I think I can only recommend that everybody should Google this and have a look at how Amazon is preparing decisions or doing problem solving internally. There's a consistent format to that you can use. Also from personal experience, there is loads of managers who sit in a meeting and don't want to listen to you having a structured idea. They want to share their opinion or they want to push through a decision. Which I think that has its place too, but there's also great beauty in shaping your thoughts and making them a little bit sharper. And there's other ways. So one thing I always do before, when you start having ideas is something that is called a morphological box. It's more or less just writing down the different criteria rather than just having ideas. I mean, we could do this, we could do that. You start writing down the individual elements or the dimensions a solution could have. So if you plan your next holiday, rather than just sharing ideas, you can say, to go, what's the duration of the holiday? Do we go for a 4-day city trip? Do we go for 1 week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks? And the non-Europeans will now wonder what is a 3-week holiday, but they do exist in Europe. Then you could say, what kind of holiday do we want? Like, is it beach or do we go hiking or do we want to do a city trip? What is the budget? So these are the individual dimensions. And that is by writing down all the options, you already help pull down the discussion. There's ways to help your thoughts mature a little bit that are not technocratic or so to say nerdy, but that are really helpful for you. Our brains were not made to sit in an office and ideas about concepts. We are built to do things. Monkey see, monkey do. And I think we're doing really well, but I think there's ways to support that.
No, that's absolutely correct. And we're feeling that right now with the podcast. Right? So I'll check the views, comments, because those are signal from the market. Is this something valuable? Like, should we keep doing this? Though our motivation is different the way you're doing Substack, right? So obviously, maybe you don't care as much of the feedback in terms of likes, comments, people who share, who restack your posts. How was that journey in terms of do you get validation from that, or you just ignore completely? Just I don't care if I write in the ether, nobody reads it. It's just for me. How do you react to this for Substack?
I think if I had 5,000 subscribers and would be earning enough money to live just from my Substack income, probably my answer would be yes. I very much care about the feedback loop. I think I may have around 60 subscribers. There's more people reading it. Just shows you that I'm doing this not just for myself, but I do it to a large part for myself. And in case anybody now checks, when I posted the last article, I didn't. Because I moved and we had our first baby. So I had more interesting and exciting things to do in the last weeks. But there's a certain dimension that you should not probably care and expect too much feedback for these kinds of newsletters unless they're really taking off.
I think you just mentioned about your hat. I do have to share that creating something that's public, that there remains on the internet, is also a nice way to have posterity, because some days you don't know when your daughter, when she's 18, when she's like or older, and she wants to read what her daddy wrote 20 years ago about AI. That's actually a very nice inheritance, not inheritance, but something to attach to the past, your view and your opinion, things like that. And they could be correct or incorrect, but both explain a bit who you are as a person. So I think that's quite nice, actually, from that perspective.
And adding, I think that's a brilliant thought that I hadn't thought about, but that is true, because loads of other work output of me will not exist in the steering committee 27 presentation that I wrote 2 years ago will have been lost, for better or worse, but these things may actually still exist. And to add one more dimension, I think Tyler Cohen said that, or is pushing this line of argument, that he's now writing mainly for AI.
Yes,
because that is one way of getting into the long-term knowledge base of humanity, is if you write and know that you will be read by AI and you will be used to train AI to some degree, you become part of the machine. I think that's an interesting idea, not one that I personally would entertain, or would. It's a comfy idea that I write so that some kind of computer gets more knowledge and can share this in the next 1,000 years. But it's a valid idea. I think that some people may find this interesting or motivating.
Yeah, I totally agree with this idea of Tareko. And I think the way to think about it is based on your background or your experience. You have unique insights. And who knows, which likely the weights of the giant neural network that will be the God AI that will control all of us.
Fully agree. And I can only recommend everybody to read exactly what Tyler Cohen said. It's much more nuanced. I took one aspect out and exaggerate to make my point.
So at Hapag-Lloyd, you had a really interesting role, as you mentioned, M&A and strategy. So what exactly does this role entail at Hapag-Lloyd?
It's more or less this, what you just said. So I was involved in many of the M&A projects over the last years. And Hapag-Lloyd has moved away from a pure play container shipping core to also investing, for example, in terminals. So I was involved in this. So there's 5-year strategies that Hapag-Lloyd has developed and that are very useful and valuable lighthouses for the development of the company. And I was also involved in other strategic projects around process improvement, the whole range of topics. If you don't have one owner who could own it, I think very often this would be topics that the entire strategy team would be looking after. And post-merger integrations, which is also Hapag-Lloyd acquired a number of smaller container shipping carriers and other assets, and we always try to make sure that they are well integrated, the people, but also the businesses into the Hapag world.
So you are in the headquarters in Germany, in Hamburg, and then if memory serves, Hapag, the one deal that I recall is Hapag acquired CSAV, right, in Latin America. So as part of your role, are you involved in the sense that you deal with the banker, external banker, the lawyers, for the initial deal setting when you acquire the assets? Is that the M&A part?
I think I answer that in regards to how most companies would do an M&A process. So it's mergers and acquisitions. You acquire another company. It's basically 2 models of why you would acquire it. Either because it is something that you are already doing, and by integrating this into your company, you generate economies of scale. In the example of container shipping, you combine services, run with larger ships at lower costs. You make customers happy. You have a denser network. So there's loads of benefits to combining a carrier that has a similar profile. And then there is the other type of M&A where this company is doing something that you cannot do or you don't do too well. For example, if you acquire a regional container shipping carrier that perhaps covers a particular market, you may not have been successful in conquering that market yourself. Perhaps you lack the local expertise or the local contacts, and that would be, so to say, another reason to do an acquisition of a carrier. So, and you already hear from this that there's a very strong strategic dimension to this. And that is also why container carrier acquiring another container carrier or a terminal would be a strategic investor. That's how we would call it in the M&A world. That's a strategic investor because their rationale is to strategically improve their own position and improve their own business. That is different from an institutional investor, like somebody who gets money from private equity or an infrastructure fund or something. They get money and they invest it into an asset and improve the performance, gain value, and at some stage they divest and return the profits and the original invested money back to their investors. And you can already see there's two very, very different ways of how a strategic investor would treat an M&A deal and how an institutional investor would treat it. The institutional investor being interested in, how quickly can I turn this around? Is there perhaps some angle? Is there perhaps some degree of professionalization that I can do to help this company? Often they involve redundancies or big restructurings, refinancings. This is stuff that is that can be quite harsh, and they mostly care about getting things done and getting things done in a very efficient manner. And they also highly incentivize the managers and their own partners, the operating partners, to create value very quickly or over a number of years, but to create value. And there's huge equity bonuses that are getting paid if the deal works. A strategic investor is very much interested to strengthen their own business over the long term. So this is not just a 3-year investment. This is 100, or like it's an investment into eternity. So at the beginning, you would usually, as a strategic investor, think very deeply about how does that fit into our business? How does it make us stronger? Does it help us solve a problem that we may be having? And that is, don't worry, that is still the answer to your question. So when you say, what is M&A in that sense, originally you would usually start with looking at how does it fit to our business? So from a very strategic point of view. And then at some stage, once you realize that perhaps this is working, perhaps this fits, perhaps we can make this work, perhaps we can integrate it well and create value, then at some stage it would become a more transactional thing where you bring on board investment banks that help the sell side, but also help the buy side to make a good deal. You would define the price. And then you look at the future target operating model. How do the two companies work together? How can we best combine the skill sets of the staff? So there's a certain playbook how you do good M&A, but I think in most cases it would start with a very strategic focus. Does it make sense for us?
How long typically a process like this will take?
I think there's no rule of thumb. It depends a bit on how fast the current owners want to sell and how easy it is to find common grounds and how easy it is to integrate. The bigger deals across the container shipping industry, some of them probably took years, and there were a number of discussions over years. Others can happen quite quickly. The 2020, 21, 22 were times with a lot of M&A activities, and some of these deals probably took a few weeks to shape up in the industry. So there was also big pressure. There were institutional investors trying to get some assets that strategic investors also wanted to get. Owners said, if I ever want to sell my business or if I ever want to sell my share, I should do it now. Yeah, this is the time. There's very high willingness to pay. So that was the heydays of M&A from 21, 22, 23.
I see. And I think also those were the years where the shipping line had a ton of cash to spend also. They were also very cash rich.
That is true. Let me share the more of an emotional angle on M&A. I think M&A is a very interesting type of work. If you do it well from a strategic point of view, if you do it with good intentions in the sense of let's integrate this, let's build this business.
Yes.
Because you need to understand the entire company. So this is a dream for a business admin student or an MBA student. This is not just understand a part of the company, but understand the whole thing. How does it work together? Where are the strengths and weaknesses or development opportunities of this company? How does it fit into our company? So you also need an end-to-end understanding of how your own company works. That is, I think this is fun because you don't just concentrate on one area of responsibility, but you try to see how are the different things connecting. And you need to look at people again. Who's in the management? Who are these people? Do we believe them that they that they would be a good contribution if we integrate them into our company. What's the skill set? What's the IT? So more or less, if you put the entirety of a company on one page, you look at the entire page.
Yeah. I think the word you haven't said also is, I think, culture. So culturally, these two companies are somewhat compatible in the way they think and the thing they care about, right? If Hapag-Lloyd very famously cares about quality of service, if the other doesn't care, it's very, very hard for them to start to work together, right? And we're involved in deal with the terminal, or that's completely separate business. You're mostly looking at the shipping line.
No, I also supported with the terminal acquisitions.
Because to me, I think to me that's fascinating also, because I think you mentioned, right, so shipping line is about buttressing the network of a shipping line. Makes sense. But terminal is a complement to the shipping line. And traditionally, all the global terminal operator, the DT operated kind of independent. But now if they get acquired by shipping line, what does that mean for the operation model? How the incentive change? Are they completely independent? That also, I think, is super interesting.
I think it was also in the past, it was a bit more nuanced. You know, there were always container shipping carriers that owned terminals. There were big terminal operators that were owned by a container shipping carrier. There were other container shipping carriers that had no terminals. So you saw everything. And I don't think that this will change going forward. So I think there's no new pattern or paradigm emerging. I think in talking not specifically about any particular container shipping carrier, but I think it's what you need to be aware of is that container shipping and terminals are very different businesses.
Yes.
One is around buying metal and utilizing it by letting that metal travel around the world. With loads of, so to say, this is around filling the ship every week, often very technical. You know, we still need to get some cargo in. So there's loads of business with loads of moving parts, and there are loads of moving parts. You know, you have perhaps 50 ports in the world where you do you have containers in the middle of the country. So there's some inland business that is connected to it. So there's loads of moving parts in container shipping. That, so to say, investment horizon of a ship will stay for, you know, if it's bought, it will stay for 15, 20, 25, 20 years perhaps. And on the other hand, you have terminals, which are often either natural monopolists or are in a situation where they share the same space with other terminals that is still a controlled market. You know, yes, there's lots of terminals, the big ones, you don't have a natural monopoly with your terminal because 200 meters further, there's another terminal. But still, you cannot move this asset. There's a much longer time investment. There's a very strong link with public interests, with concessions. So the balance sheet, the profit and loss statements, the cash flow statements look very different for these two businesses. Yeah. And I think the interesting question is, what do you need to run both businesses and give both businesses enough attention and loving care as management to make sure that you develop both businesses well at the same time? Because they are rather different. Yes, they are linked, but they're directly physically linked, but they are still rather different.
Great. My mental model for terminal is a landlord, right? It's basically a shopping mall. You're physically located here. You have a foot traffic that comes in determined by the economy, right? So if you build a terminal in China, it's manufactured in China. But in India, it's the same thing. You go to countries where the economy is growing, right, where they need to move things. You can invest to improve the operation so that your throughput is better. Basically, the amount of volume that goes through is always constant. You don't fully control it. However, you can control your cost. And that's the only parameter you have, effectively, cutting the cost as low as you can. You don't have to worry too much about feeding the ship because that's not your job. That's a shipping line's job. I hear you. Fundamentally, structurally, and also the way to run is different. Because we are going to a world where it's more dynamic, more complicated, some, at least container line, have a view that they need to have more control. And by controlling the physical asset, which is the node in the network, they can potentially provide a differentiated service, which I think in theory is correct. So right now, the most recent development, let's say strategic change, everybody's talking about this, which is the Gemini Alliance between Hapag-Lloyd and Maersk, where effectively where you have a kind of a hub and spoke model compared to traditionally port-to-port transportation. What are your thoughts on this? Before you answer, let me maybe give you the straw man, what people say. Typically people say, it's just transshipment. What's the big deal? And transshipment is bad. The more transshipment you have, there's a chance my container will get lost. So how should we think about this change, which is actually very close to the airlines?
Yeah. Bertrand, I think you put your finger on the spot. This is a model that has been used for many decades in the airline business, and it works. And if it works for an industry that is not too different, you need to make a case why it should not work in your industry rather than explaining why it should work in your industry. The hub and spoke models, and perhaps for everybody, if you're not aware with the concept, in a hub and spoke model, you bring goods or passengers into one hub from lots of places, often like from far and from nearby. One example is Emirates Airlines, because I think that's probably one of the most interesting and well-run airlines around. So they fly passengers from Europe into Dubai, and then they connect on 2 flights to Asia or to Africa. So there's a clear stream, and there's a logic, and there's a network. So all the European flights arrive at a certain time, and then 2-3 hours later, all the Asian and African flights depart. That requires you to have a really well-run terminal, because you need to channel those. So there's hours when nothing happens in Dubai, and then there's hours when thousands and 10,000s and perhaps 100,000s of passengers run through the terminals. So that's the case for owning the airport. So like if you have a hub, you should own it, or you should have at least some share in it to control it, because running a good airport or port or terminal is really important to make hub and spoke work. And the other thing is that you need to be really on time with everything. So the flights need to depart Europe on time. They need to arrive in Dubai on time. They need to depart Dubai on time. Otherwise, the whole system doesn't work. And historically, I think that was the biggest obstacle to trying something similar in container shipping, is that the schedule reliability would not be sufficient to avoid the whole system collapsing. Once, if you have the choice between waiting for your connecting ship to come in for 2 days and then departing 2 days later and bringing a follow-on delay, or sailing on time and not having the cargo, both are really bad options. They're both really bad, and you lose money in both cases. One is very capital inefficient, and the other creates a lot of customer dissatisfaction, because the boxes will remain in the terminal for a week. But if you can ensure that the different sides of the hub and spoke more or less depart on time, then it's a system that just by definition is more efficient. Because why should you have a 24,000 TEU ship run across 5 different Chinese ports and then to Singapore and then perhaps somewhere else before it goes to Europe? That is capital inefficient, that you have an asset that can deliver, that can steam, for example, from Singapore to Europe, and generates 24,000 TEUs on that journey. Why should that vessel spend and waste time before picking up 3,000 boxes in a Chinese port? Rather, if you know that you can combine 2 ports, 3,000 in one, 3,000 the other, rather have a smaller ship, collect the boxes there, bring them to a hub, and then fill the big ship and sail off. And keeping in mind that we have very high and very attractive economies of scale in container shipping. You should operate the largest possible ship that you can. If you look at the airline world, hub and spoke system allows you to operate much larger planes, because you bring cargo into a hub. There's very few airports that can generate demand locally to fill an A380. London, perhaps, New York, Hong Kong, Tokyo, but most airports need transfer passengers to generate economies of scale to fill larger planes. And that benefits everybody. It benefits the carrier, because they can operate at lower cost and perhaps underbid their competitor. But you already see it also benefits the customer, because your container shipping carrier can operate at lower cost. So there's no reason it should not work, as long as you can sail both sides of your network on time.
Yeah, I think that's something that people are missing. When the thing came out, I also thought they may be charging a premium for more reliable service, because if I offer you high quality service and people say, well, I don't want to pay for the reliability, it's just theoretical. In the end, if I hear correctly, what you're saying is you don't even have to charge a premium, because inherently you can actually wring out some efficiency from operational perspective. That should lower the cost. But now, let me challenge a bit what you said, because I think you're also very careful, because you made one sentence, as long as you can have those shipment arrive on time between the hubs. So I think that's a big if, right? For this model to work, I guess you need to have control of those hubs. The second thing, I'm curious how you think about this. To some degree, having a terminal-to-terminal connection is a very resilient system, meaning if one node shuts down, it doesn't matter because you have like all those bilateral connection. So when you guys looked at that system from a strategy perspective, how do you assess this risk? Because to me, that is a black swan event, which may never happen.
I think I answer that in more general terms. If you run a company, you have people that are responsible for a particular area. And, if you have a chemical factory, you tell people, make sure that the factory doesn't blow up every other day. People will follow up and make sure that the company doesn't blow up every other day. So to take an extreme example, find the right steps. And yes, everybody will play their role and be part of the choir and make sure that they do their part. And that also applies to, for example, container shipping. So there's different people that own different parts of the operations, also in the commercial side. And if you tell them to do a certain thing, then I think they will get around and get these things done.
Maybe we can talk next about AI applied to shipping. So based on your reading and my own experience of AI, right? It feels like today, most of the use case that I see is using Gen AI for programming, for coders, and also for content creators, like generating videos, text. So that's the use case where actually I see it's pretty clear how it potentially can add value. What do you think can be applied today for the shipping lines?
Let me state my hypothesis first, and then we dissect that and see how this comes about. There's lots of different timelines. When will we have superhuman intelligence, and when will AI run the world? Let's assume for the next 4 or 5 years, we may have very, very smart AI that may be on human level, but not something that is superhuman. In this case, I think there's two very, very different setups for traditional container shipping carriers. And let's compare this, for example, with digital players in the logistics field, because I think this is maybe two interesting examples to contrast. I think for container shipping carriers, the impact of AI will be material, but it will not change the face of the industry. It will not change the business model. Carriers will do what they're doing right now. They will do it better. They may do it faster. They may offer higher quality, and they may offer smarter solutions, but it will not be materially different. If you look at the digital logistics landscape, supply chain management, digital forwarding, they will be very, very strongly affected. And for them, it could be finally the breakout, because there haven't been any super successful players in this. There haven't been any Ubers or Googles or super successful players. For them, this could be a real chance, or it could be the end of the industry if they are not careful. Why is it so different for the two? I think one key aspect is the share of personnel cost of the total revenues. And container shipping, believe it or not, has, if you look across industries, one of the lowest shares of personnel cost. So this is like the cost, the salaries and the social cost, the overhead costs you pay to your staff divided by your revenues. So container shipping is relatively efficient in terms of staff being used, and that puts a lot of pressure out from the system. The companies that are focused much more on how can AI help me, they're mainly looking at it from a let's save personnel cost angle, and mainly in Western Europe or North America, where personnel costs are, of course, much higher than in other parts of the world. Yeah. So they have a very strong incentive. So there we have shareholders, investors pushing, you have really high personnel costs. That is your chance to reduce them. Go for it. And that creates incentives for boards and for managers to explore this.
Sorry, what is the percentage on average of like the staff?
I think shooting from the hip, I would say between 4 to 7%.
Okay,
in across the different carriers. Like many of them don't report, but like it's the same pattern. You have a headquarter, you have staff around the world. To compare this directly, any kind of digital startup will have a very high share of people in the software development, which will be really important. And if they are operating a logistics product, you can digitize all you want. In the end, you have customers calling, you need to call vendors. So there is a very high share, and you may have some digital startups in the logistics fields that have high double-digit percentage of staff cost, especially if you have startups that sell on other goods, so that they have their total revenues are bloated because then you need to subtract the costs of goods sold. So they buy something, they transport from a container shipping carrier and the trucking from a trucker. You need to take this out of the revenue. This is not their real top line. And then if you look at the corrected top line, that their personnel costs could be super material. For them, this is like, so to say this, for anything that helps make staff more efficient, that helps less staff do more, I think could be a real breakthrough for these digital players. And they're also already digital, so there's many data pots that they can tap into. There's also a digital mindset. These companies' staff are younger, more proactive, more willing to engage with AI. So I would see if there's any player in the wider field of logistics to benefit, I think it's the digital players if they do it right. And if they don't do it right, this could be the end of their business if they have a competitor who's able to pull down personnel costs or do more with the same scale, for example. Many of these products are around selling to customers. So if you can do with the same sales team, if you can enter a big new market with having the same sales team, with the support of AI co-pilots, more proactive tools of customer interactions, this could be the breakthrough that your business needs. And if another company doesn't do it or does do it 12 months later, that could be very, very dangerous for their continued existence. So that explains why I think the digital startups, the digital logistics world will benefit. The amplitude of what they can take away from AI is very high. Let's look at the industry across all carriers. What I always like to do is look at the P&L. Because that gives you a good feeling of what the company is about. Can AI, like LLMs, large language models, co-pilots, agents, so to say, take over individual jobs? Can they help on improving the top line? So improve the revenues. I think there may be some benefits to make decisions faster on which customers to take on board. I recommend everybody listens to the first episodes of this podcast of you trying to get out of Adrian Pina how exactly trades and sales agree on which cargo to put on board. I think that's a riddle that nobody has found out. But that could be there's lots of coordination problems, I would call them. What cargo do I put on board? But this is not something I would ever automate completely. This is not something where a large language model may be well suited to make the decisions because it's not based on pure logic. There's data pots you need to combine. So I don't think that the revenue quality, the yield, what you can earn with a box will significantly be improved. There may be small improvements. There may be smarter decision making, but I don't see that there's still a very large degree of coordination between different departments, different stakeholders, making sure that the right cargo comes on board. There's also a large degree of coordination with customers, and I don't think that there will be a material benefit. I mean, 5-6% higher revenues is already very good. But if you look at AI, if you look at much higher share of benefits or much higher potential of upside for society and economy on the scale of an economy, 6% higher GDP per capita is already huge. This is huge. But if you do that on an annual basis, it's life-changing. But if you just do it once, it will be nice.
So I understand. I agree with you. If you use just ALM for the shipping, it's probably not going to change. The one caveat to that is go back to the conversation we had earlier about commoditization and bespoke product. Can you imagine a world where if you use AI to understand better your customer, it gives you more flexibility to create a better product so that it increases the stickiness of your customer? Right now, that's my discussion with a bunch of container carriers. Like we have 50% of the global throughput. That's how much a business we owed from global trade. It doesn't matter if my service is bad. But what if using AI, you can offer better bespoke product without changing drastically your operation? Doesn't that create some form of leverage? Maybe it's easier to operate. You can distinguish yourself. And in terms of crisis, you don't have to face the same pressure. What do you think about that?
To apply airline thinking on container shipping, I think there's probably two types of products. There's physical products that actually have a physical impact on you. Like a first class seat is nicer than an economy class seat. Then there's virtual products. For example, you being rebooked in case your flight gets stranded and you get rebooked before the guys. Yeah. That is a virtual product. because it doesn't really, yes, it has a physical impact on you. You spend one night less in the airport hotel, but it is a product, so to say, where you decide that it has a virtual dimension or getting faster access to the customer hotline. So there's two products. I think in container shipping, a lot of the products are physical. And I think, at least from what I would say here, AI may help create and maintain and build some virtual products in container shipping. But I think the industry is structured rather differently. And if many customers find out that you are trying to implement virtual product differentiation, there will be a certain backlash. I'm not saying it will not happen, because I'm not a commercial guy, and I'm rather far away from the commercial world. But if I apply my airline knowledge, where I have much better understanding of the commercials, I would say that there's less demand and less interest, and there will be strong backlash against introducing virtual products. But I agree with you. AI could be a way to offer more differentiated products. Whenever a customer finds out that you actively decided to let the box sit longer just because that customer paid less, because that's what happens with airlines. Yeah,
Yes.
If you fly economy class, you queue in the for everybody else. If you fly business class, you get the fast track. So there is a fast track available, but the airline decides, or the airport decides, to send you through the long line for security control. And I think the container shipping is different there, and I think the customers may not want to accept. I think if you look at the cost elements, can AI help us reduce the cost? There's the big costs around using the assets and being capital efficient, just the network and the containers. If you want to improve a network, this is the traveling salesman problem, you probably need loads of simulations, like Monte Carlo simulations. You need to simulate this is like, you have an asset and there's different ways to deploy the asset that's simulated. This is available, and I think many carriers are doing these kinds of works already. This is not a prime use case for AI. Yes, I think it's rather a prime use case for quantum computing. Because let's run much more simulations, and quantum computing, perhaps for everybody's background, is just a totally different way of building computers that are much, much, much faster than anything we have today. And especially for these kind of simulations where let's try this, let's change some parameters and see whether that would make the asset be better utilized. So I don't think, there may be some benefits here or there, but I don't think that they will be material. And then the other big cost item is fuel, terminal procurement, these things. Yes, you may support the procurement guys to prepare better negotiation storylines, be smarter around how you procure, but in the end, it will cost how much fuel will cost. And the terminals will also use AI co-pilots to explain to the carriers why they have to charge more this year. I don't think that there will be a material difference.
No, I would tend to agree with you. Operation research is really the area where you probably get the best benefit from the shipping line. And then, so you were mentioning about digital freight forwarder, but I think it's not just digital freight forwarders. Whoever who's involved in this space will facilitate the move of goods, of cargo, the trade, that still fundamentally relies a lot on people, on people-based process, like sending email, making phone calls, who can potentially benefit. I guess one example could be freight forwarders. What other type of job you think in the global trade can be potentially benefit and transformed by this?
I think in container shipping, you have huge benefits if you own the asset. If you own the asset, you have that automatically increases your top line because you get paid for using the asset, and then personnel costs get materially lower in share, and that is the key benefit of container shipping. I don't see anybody who doesn't own assets become materially stronger.
I see. So you don't think a freight forwarder will become stronger because they have...
Freight forwarders, I think they can certainly become better in what they're doing because they have even more coordination problems because they buy services from others and they can repackage and they can probably be much smarter and faster in many of these decisions. But I think there will be no new businesses. That's a very dangerous thing to say. There will be no new business. I don't really see that any of the digital models that worked only halfway or that did not work over the last years can now take off.
I see.
There may be new models, there may be new ideas. That's the cool thing about entrepreneurs. There's probably always people who want to do things differently. I think if the model didn't work over the last years, I don't necessarily see that it will take off.
Yeah, I have slightly contrarian take on this one because maybe I'm being naive here, but I feel the one thing that's quite interesting, right, is the freight forwarding market is super, super fragmented. So you have the container line, you have like the top 10 line control 80% of the volume. The freight forwarders, it's super fragmented, right? And they all have some sort of a specialization or aspect. They're quite strong, even the big one, right? But the question I always had is like, why can't you have one who by the nature of scale, can start to scale up much bigger? Like, why can Kuehne+Nagel, a DSV or DHL have like 30% of volume of a freight forward, like much, much bigger volume because of scale? And traditionally, the response I got, it doesn't happen, is because it's complicated. As you say, coordination problem. You have to have office everywhere. The process is different this country to this country. And to be able to serve your customer well, you need people. And you need people in a lot of places, have very different SLA way to do things. All the exchange is not technically all digital. If one of those freight forwarder use better the technology to coordinate, they can potentially have a massive leverage and grow much faster because they already have the DNA. They understand what the customer wants. So it's not about getting rid of people, having less people, but increasing the number of transactions the single individual who have the knowledge can handle. Because suddenly LLM is feeding them the information, and they have to deal less with the mundane problem, but they can focus on the high value problem that potentially only a human can handle. Maybe a traditional freight forwarder who have a very strong network in all those countries, if they digitize correctly the tacit knowledge, they can really reap the rewards. Do you agree with this?
You just described a scenario where one forwarder becomes larger than the others. This is a market that is in a certain equilibrium, and I don't see like, yes, this new technology may change and may give somebody a head start, but none of these use cases would be necessary. Others can replicate them. The other forwarder A can do something that forwarder B can also replicate. And there's a certain degree from the customer side who want a wider choice of forwarders to work with, the carriers, the other parts of the industry. I don't see that there is something that one player in this industry can do that would be so upsetting that they would become dominating. Because again, dominating, you already hear in the word, dominating will have impacts on prices, on capacities. The system will, to some degree, auto-correct in such a case.
And that's interesting. That is correct. You may not have an integration point, right? Like not the Google of search, right? You don't have a Google of freight forwarding. Then this freight forwarder become too powerful because that means effectively the container line are completely dependent on this one freight forwarder who have so much power over them. They become commoditized, and then the physical world doesn't matter as much because all the instruction, all the demand will come from this single hypothetical freight forwarder. If I hear correctly, what you're saying is they make it some benefit, but you don't necessarily think the market structure of freight forwarder will change drastically because the market would demand have diversification and choices between providers, even for the freight forwarders.
I think that's my hypothesis, but as said, like we're talking about AI, we don't even know how it will affect us in general terms. So how would we know whether in the left corner of the engine room of global trade, how it will affect the structure of forwarding or container shipping? If the problem by a particular business model hasn't taken off yet, is the problem the product or is the problem the price? If the problem is the price, AI will significantly reduce the price and will make the business take off. If the problem is more with the product, you can AI to be smarter and develop better products, but it will not have a material impact. So that's my short answer. The key question is the problem the price or the product?
So if I rephrase it, your view is right now those digital logistic companies have not built a compelling enough product for whatever reason, right? Because lack of data, difficulty to deal at scale with all those people who participate in trade, and therefore the product is not sufficient to solve the problem of the customer. Then having AI doesn't change anything. It's just having a better tool to do something that people don't want. Okay, so if I go deeper, like what do you think potentially the thing that prevents a better product? Is it because lack of data? Is it the sales cycle? Is the market too fragmented?
Well, I think it's all of them. So you need to have a good understanding of what actually the customers want to buy. This industry is more specific than many B2C industries. Uber knew that people just want a taxi service from A to B. So this is a pretty specific industry. So it may be more difficult to understand what customers want. Then it's more difficult to generate scale. It is more difficult to find a niche that is not already occupied. It is more difficult to operate at sufficiently low cost that you can compete on price. Then it's also a sales problem. How can you get into the schedules of the decision makers? So I think it's, in case there's a morphological box, to come back to that, of all the potential ways how to run or how to establish something, it's probably there's some improvement potential probably across all dimensions.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think even the sales cycle also, right? Sales cycle is much longer than a normal for like SaaS product. Like it may take you at least 1 or 2 years to sell a customer in the SaaS land. Or the startup will run out of money before you can sell your first deal.
Yes, and much more customers will have much more need for interaction than any SaaS product.
Yeah.
The SaaS product, you buy it off the shelf and you better take it as it comes delivered, or you pay a few $1 million for some SAP or Salesforce consultants to customize something. But you more or less take what you get. Here, customers would expect to customize. And yes, you can say we need to be strong and strict. As long as somebody else is willing to customize, you have a problem if you don't customize.
I think another question that's super interesting to me is for AI, right? So there is right now a law model coming from US, right? So the closed source model, ChatGPT, Claude, and then at least this year, suddenly you have more open source model from China. So the DeepSeek, the Kimi, the Qwen. I was born in China, grew up in France. So Europe is actually dear, close and dear to my heart. I think you worked for many years in Germany, and you're German also. It seems that Europe does not have kind of a stake in the game of AI. It feels like it's dominated by the two poles, US and China. In your opinion, what should change, or what can we do so that Europe still also maintain a stake in sovereignty?
I think there's far better commentators and experts on these matters. To build a good AI system or infrastructure, you need to have access to very smart people. You need to have access to a lot of capital. You need to have access to cheap electricity. And I think Europe has found it, and will also going forward will find it very difficult to supply these three. I think that does not that is probably not too promising. If it's around sovereignty, and coming back to my geopolitics background, Europe shares a land border with Russia. And as long as Russia is doing what Russia is doing, Europe should probably rather focus on the defense industry, and not just tanks, but also drones, the digital side of it. If you talk about sovereignty, I think euros are better invested in building a strong defense industry, and that may be something where you can also draw on existing strengths of European companies.
That's also interesting is what I see a lot of smart people in Europe these days. Unfortunately, they don't stay in Europe. If they like US, they go to US. If they don't like US, they go to Dubai. And one region where I see a lot of talented people, smart people, unfortunately going to leaving Europe, which makes it a bit worrisome. But as you say, things come in cycle. At some point, I think the country will figure out what's the best path forward for Europe as well. It was a pleasure talking to you, Kai. I think I've learned a lot, even though I thought I knew about shipping industry, but you give me a completely different way to think about the value of AI to the shipping industry and to the supply chain world. Where can we find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn, and you can become subscriber number 61 on my Substack.
You're also starting a consulting firm, right?
Yes, I have started a consulting business. So if you are interested, please do reach out via LinkedIn.
Okay, so we'll put your LinkedIn in the show notes. Thanks a lot, Kai, for this very interesting conversation. Please like, comment, and share. Until we meet at the Schelling Point, where ideas will meet again.